Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this mini video will begin our conversation about conducting and writing a literary analysis. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start with the PowerPoint that I have created to help facilitate this conversation. Okay, so let's start when thinking about the introduction. Now, honestly, when I'm teaching a writing class, I often advise you not to start your paper by writing the introduction. That often you need to do some writing within the body of your paper to conduct your interpretation, to conduct your analysis, and then come back to writing your introduction, right? Because, you don't know what you're going to write until you start writing it. And so maybe the introduction isn't the best place to start with your writing process. However, with the essay, you do need the introduction to be in the beginning. So let's talk about introduction strategies, okay? The introduction, even for a literary analysis, is of course setting up your topics, of course doing all of those things, but it still needs to be attention getting, right? Just because you're writing an academic paper does not mean it should be dull and boring. If it is dull and boring to you, it is going to be dull and boring to anybody else reading it. Okay, so you want to try to tap into your reader and get them to read the rest of your essay by providing an attention-getting, provocative introduction that gets them interested in what else you have to say. Right. So what are some strategies for this? Well, you probably know these things, but one way is to start with a provocative quote. And for literary analysis, this is particularly useful because you can actually draw a quote from the text that you're analyzing, right? A particularly interesting quote, you've got help from a professional writer, and that not only brings in the attention of your audience, but it sets up what your topic is going to be about. It introduces the text that you're analyzing, right? And even begins to probably even set up your argument. So that's a great strategy. And also, it just helps you ground what you're going to be talking in and not be writing from a blank page. So it's actually quite a useful strategy for a literary analysis. Another way to do this is to start out with a provocative question about the text, right? Something that is very interesting or controversial or contradictory or something like that, that you are going to explore with your analysis of the text. Now, remember, when you ask a question, you have to answer it by the end of your essay. So just make sure that you do that. Or maybe in your introduction, you're going to challenge a common understanding of the text, right? Like Othello, right? If we think about Othello, those of you who've read Othello, often his fatal flaw is seen as jealousy, right? Maybe you're going to challenge that idea that, it's long been argued that Othello's fatal flaw is jealousy, but something else. Okay. Um, what you should not do is overgeneralize. Don't start out with broad statements like throughout time there's always been racism. Throughout time women have been oppressed. Those are too big, too worldly, right? You need to stay focused in on your text. Because, first of all, you can't prove that. Second of all, you don't need to. And third of all, it undermines your argument when you make too broad of statements like that. So even though you may have been taught to do that, just try to stay away from those really big, overgeneralizing statements and jump right into the specifics of the text that you're going to be analyzing. Your introduction can also set up the context for what you're going to prove. And it can also, bring in a counter argument, that idea of like, this is what people are saying, but you're going to prove that, there's a different interpretation for this, or that interpretation is not complete, or that interpretation has not considered the evidence that you're going to be considering, right? So that is another thing you can do in your introduction. Um, and then, of course, your introduction should end with your thesis statement. Now, some people think that the thesis statement is and has to be the last sentence of your introduction, I mean, of your first paragraph. Only if your paragraph is the end of your introduction. If you're writing a long paper, you know, 10, 50, 100 pages, then your introduction very well may be longer than one paragraph. If you're writing a 3 to 5 page paper, your introduction probably should be contained within 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then at the end of that, you will put your thesis statement. Now, I have another video on thesis statements that I encourage you to watch. But let me just quickly go over the ideas of a thesis statement for a literary analysis here, right? So think of a thesis statement as an answer to a question, right? So if you want a good thesis statement, you have to ask a good question. The writing assignments should help you frame that question, right? But you want to make sure that you are answering a question that requires analysis. So, for example, one question might be, you know, what does Frankenstein, whether or not you're reading Frankenstein in your class or not, most of us at least know the character of Victor Frankenstein and his monster, right? So we have a cultural understanding of that anyway, right? So we might ask the question, pardon me, what does Frankenstein, the novel, suggest about the roles and responsibilities of a mother? What, or maybe a father, or maybe you want to go more general, like a parent. And then you're going to conduct an analysis to see what the text is suggesting about those roles and come up with some kind of thesis statement that you're seeing the text is suggesting about those roles, right? And then that you can prove through analysis of the text. A thesis must be arguable. That means that somebody also reading Frankenstein could interpret it differently than what you are suggesting, right? And so it must be arguable. So, for example, you cannot have a thesis that says in Frankenstein, the creature kills William because he wants revenge against Victor. That is why the creature kills William. That's exactly why. It's stated in the text. There's no arguing that, right? And so you can't put that as your thesis statement because nobody reading the text could argue against it. Um, you have to be able to have a thesis statement that you prove through analysis of the text, not just listing of things, right? So, for example, you cannot have a thesis that says in Frankenstein, the creature is treated poorly by the villagers, right? Because all you have to do is list all the times the villagers treat him poorly, and you've proven it. But so what? You didn't need proving. We knew that already going in, right? So make sure that the question that you're framing and the answer that you're giving it is an arguable statement. Thesis statements are tough. I'm not going to lie. And you have to do some investigation before you get to it. But these are things to kind of keep you on track. Um, and most importantly is remember, you cannot use a text, one single text, to prove something about the society in general, right? So, for example, you can't say that the villagers' treatment of the creature proved that humans discriminate against people based on appearance. It doesn't prove that, right? There's no way you can take a fictional text and make this grand statement about a human truth, right? It doesn't prove that. So you want to stay away from these grand statements and instead only prove what the text itself is suggesting. Okay. Now this awareness may make it relevant for us to consider, and that's something you want to bring on in your conclusion, but don't try to prove some universal truth using one single text. It does not, it is a flaw in your argument, and it cannot do what you're suggesting. Okay. At best, it can heighten awareness, but it cannot prove something like that. All right. Then we get to the actual interpretation and analysis. Okay, I have other videos on this. I have a TIEIA video on this that will help you. But let me quickly go over things to consider when you're conducting your interpretation and your analysis. Okay, so first of all, you want to avoid plot summary. You must assume when you're writing a literary analysis that your audience has already read the text. You do not need to summarize because your audience has read it. Maybe you need to remind them they didn't read it yesterday, or you're calling attention to a certain part of it that you think, they need to, that needs to be highlighted. That's fine, but don't spend your time retelling the story. If you're lapsing into first this happened, then this happened, then this happened, you're in plot summary, stop, pull away, go back into analysis. The TIEIA strategy will help you with that. Um, don't leave out textual evidence that goes against your point, right? That's not honest. That's not ethical, right? And so if there is textual evidence that goes against your point, you still have to bring it in and reconcile it, right? You still have to reconcile it to why your point is still valid despite this moment in the text. Um, Interpretation is when we look at parts of the text and we ask the question, what does it mean? And why does it mean what I say it means? Right. So whether or not we're looking at a passage, we're looking at a plot point, we're looking at a metaphor, we're looking at a cultural reference, something in there, we're trying to say what it means, and then you have to show why it means what you say that it means. And then analysis, by the way, interpretation and analysis sometimes are used synonymously, but for this class, I want you to kind of separate them out. Interpretation, we're asking the question, what does it mean? Analysis, how does your interpretation prove your thesis? Okay. Remember with interpretation, you can't just tell us this is what it means. You have to show us how you got there. Why does it mean? Think of it like a math problem. With a math problem, you can't just show the answer. You have to show how you got there. Same is true for literary interpretation. Why does the language mean what you say that means? Why does the metaphor mean what you say it means? Okay. So show us that. Show us in your interpretation why it means what you say it means. And you also may want to consider the counter argument. Remember, if you don't have a counter argument, you don't have a literary analysis, right? So you might want to show why people might disagree with this interpretation. And you could show why they're wrong. It may not be wrong, but maybe they haven't considered it in the same way that you are considering it, right? And so that you show that your argument is valid, okay? So that is something you want to think about in conducting your interpretation and your analysis. Ways to get at it, I have a whole other video on this under literary theories, right? But ways that we get at the questions we want to ask when conducting a literary analysis tie into close readings of passages, looking at plot points, analyzing our characters, analyzing our metaphors, looking at the historical context of the story, not just of when the setting of the story is, but when it was actually published and written. We want to look at issues of culture, like race, class, gender, sexuality, age, anything that marks a group or someone within a group as dominant or marginalized within the culture. We want to look at our responses to the text, right? How are we connecting to the text? Where are we surprised? Where do we have an emotional response? And what is causing that? And we want to, of course, look for the silences, those things that are touched on in the text, but also left out. Right? Why couldn't it be totally left out? Why is a character in there but has no lines or is silenced? What is happening in the text that suggests listen, there's a game going on, but we're not really exploring the game. We're exploring something outside of the game. Why are we leaving out the game, right? So looking for the silences is another avenue of getting at literary analysis. Again, I have a video on TIEIA, which more gets into how to write and conduct a TIEIA paragraph. But TIEIA paragraphs is a format I'm going to want you to use in some of your body paragraphs of your literary analysis. You do not use this paragraph structure in an introduction or a conclusion, but it is a great formula for making sure that you don't lapse into plot summary, and that you show your analysis, okay? And that is the T, topic sentence, I, introduction of evidence, E is your evidence, second I, interpretation of evidence, and A is your analysis, right? And so your topic sentence is going to be a subpoint, right? It's something that you're going to prove in that paragraph. It is generally the first paragraph of a first sentence of your body paragraph. And so you don't want your first sentence of a body paragraph to summarize something that's happening in the story because that doesn't need proving. Instead, you want to state clearly, it's like a mini thesis statement, really. What one point are you going to prove in that paragraph? Okay. And state it clearly. It should be succinct and arguable. Then you want to have maybe some transition and you're going to introduce your evidence. You don't want to just drop your evidence in. You don't want to just drop a quote in, right? You have to like introduce, you know, in Frankenstein, Victor says, right? And then you bring in the evidence or something like that. And the E, of course, is the evidence. That is what you're going to draw from the text, whether it's a direct quote or a paraphrase or a summary of something that you're going to be analyzing regarding a character. But that's going to be your evidence. And then your interpretation of your evidence. The evidence, what does it mean? Why does it mean what you say it means? And then your analysis, how does your interpretation of this evidence prove your topic sentence and or your thesis statement? Transitions are also very important, right? Transitions is actually what gives you sort of control of your essay. It is those moments where you are showing your connections between the paragraphs. Why is this one paragraph following this other paragraph? Why is this one point following this point? How are these two things connected? Showing those connections in your transitions is where you are claiming your authority within the essay. It's where you're showing your brilliance. Okay. And the transitions between paragraphs generally are in the last sentences of the previous paragraph and the first sentences of your first paragraph, where you're showing the connection. How are these two ideas connected, right? Actually state it. Go beyond first, second, third, right? Now we're lapsing into listing. No, show us how these two ideas are connected. And remember, uh, the transitions are almost as important as your thesis. Your thesis is you, your transitions is you. Okay, so make sure that you work on those transitions. And in the conclusion, finally, at the end of your literary analysis, what you don't want to do, especially in a 3 to 5 page essay, which is so short, you don't want to waste time and space restating your thesis and your argument, right? We just read it. It was 3 pages ago. We can remember that far back. Now, and this is a valuable skill to be able to restate your thesis and argument without being over repetitive, but that's only necessary if you're writing a 20-page paper or whatnot, right? So you're reminding your audience what it is that you're arguing. That's fine. But in this short of a paper, don't waste your time and your space on that. Instead, what you want to do is assume that you've proven your thesis statement, right? You've done it. Yay, you're on it. You've proven it. Now, why does it matter, right? Why does it matter to an audience today? Why is it important that an audience today reads Frankenstein? reads your interpretation of Frankenstein, why does it matter to them? Why does it matter to society today? How is this relevant? Okay, this is what you want to do in your conclusion. And do not overgeneralize. Do not over, you know, moralize, okay? Literally show the connections from that story to some event or something that is happening in the world today, in human lives today, right? In your life today, make a personal connection, something that shows the relevance of your argument and the text to readers of today. Write that in your conclusion. It's much more interesting, and it'll also help you tie back to your introduction and put a nice little bow around your whole essay, which is something we call coherence. Okay, so I hope that you have found this video useful. I look forward to reading your essays and enjoy making those interpretation connections. Okay, have a great day.